December of 2015, 65-year-old professor David Lennick was meditating in his seat as his plane landed at Philadelphia International Airport. David was an economics professor at a university in Los Angeles, and he also ran a meditation group on campus. Meditation kept David grounded, especially during long and noisy flights like this one from LA to Philly. David took another cleansing breath as the plane rolled toward the gate. A few minutes later, he stood up to grab his luggage from the overhead compartment, and as he did, a sharp pain pierced his cheek, just to the left of his nose. David flinched and instinctively reached up and began massaging the pain point, which helped a little bit. He moved down the aisle toward the exit door, still rubbing his cheek, and slowly the pain dissipated. David had never experienced a muscle spasm like that, but he chalked it up to exhaustion and headed for the baggage claim. 3 months later, in March, David tapped his fingers on the exam table at his doctor's office. He was feeling nervous. Since his trip to Philadelphia, he'd experienced a few more painful spasms in his cheek. But over the last week, those sharp bursts of pain had become a daily occurrence. He was worried they could be related to his history with brain surgery. Almost 20 years earlier, David was diagnosed with pituitary adenoma, a small benign tumor located on his pituitary gland, which is just behind the nose. And so he had to undergo brain surgery and also radiation treatments to remove the tumor. But he'd been free of symptoms ever since. However, now he was worried that the tumor might be back, or that something related to the surgery might be causing this new pain. So he'd come in for an MRI and other tests. A few moments later, his doctor walked into the room. He had good news. David's tumor was not back. In fact, the doctor couldn't find anything physically wrong with him at all. He asked if David was under more stress than usual. It was possible that the pain could actually be psychological. That didn't mean the pain was imaginary, just that it might stem from a combination of factors. But that did not sound plausible to David. He was an avid meditator, which gave him an excellent coping mechanism for stress. Besides, nothing was really weighing on him. He had actually been enjoying himself over the past few months, except for these new cheek spasms. He told the doctor as much, and then said he wanted a second opinion. The doctor nodded and said he had an idea. He recommended that David go see an ear, nose, and throat specialist, or ENT, and he promised he would send in the referral right away. Two weeks later, David walked out of that ENT's office feeling frustrated. The ENT had ordered more scans of David's head and had found that he had a deviated septum, which meant the cartilage that divided David's nostrils was off-center. But the ENT didn't think a deviated septum would cause this stabbing pain in David's cheek. And like David's other doctor, the ENT also concluded that the pain might be psychological. And then he proceeded to ask David if he was under extra stress at work. Nothing David said could convince the ENT otherwise. So eventually David gave up. He would just have to find a different way of dealing with these spasms. Another few weeks later, David paced at the front of a lecture hall, flicking through a PowerPoint presentation, and he had just arrived on the final slide when the pain in his cheek returned. And it returned like an explosion, sending sharp bolts of pain across his whole face. He winced so hard he nearly dropped the clicker in his hand, but then tried his best to recover. He didn't want his students to know that anything was wrong here, but at the same time, it felt like the muscles beneath his skin were literally on fire. He took a deep breath and tried to use his meditating skills and put mind over matter here and get through the presentation, but he couldn't. The pain was so intense, he had to end the lecture early. Back in his office, David rushed over to his desk, opened up his lunchbox, and fished out the ice pack he'd brought to keep his food fresh. Then he placed it on his face, hoping it would take the edge off his pain. At that moment, he knew for sure that so far his doctors had been wrong. This was not a psychological problem. Something was physically wrong here. He just needed to find the right doctor who could prove that. 10 minutes later, David's cheek was still throbbing despite this ice pack. So he put the ice pack away and then stepped into the hallway to call his dentist. He figured, maybe if the problem wasn't in his ears, nose, or throat, maybe it was in his teeth. About a month later, David sat in a reclining dental chair, trying his best to breathe calmly, as an oral pain specialist shot streams of cold water directly into the painful side of his mouth. David had gone to see his dentist, who then referred him to this specialist. But this specialist didn't find anything physically wrong with David's teeth. So he proposed an unusual way to help David cope with what appeared to be a psychological problem. He wanted to train David's mind to simply ignore the shooting pain in his left cheek. And so the specialist told David to open and close his mouth while he, the specialist, shot streams of cold water at David's gums. David opened his mouth and tried hard not to flinch as the specialist did this, but each burst of water felt like he had touched a live wire. David tried to ignore the pain, but by the time the specialist finally put down the water scaler and handed him a paper towel, his whole jaw was throbbing. The specialist slid his stool back from the dental chair and then told David to mimic this exercise at home, and eventually he would get results. In the meantime, he was going to prescribe David an antidepressant that's also sometimes used to treat facial pain. David was not optimistic here. He felt like he had just undergone a round of torture for nothing. But he would try the medication and try the exercise and see if maybe this specialist was right. But a month later, in the summer of 2016, David was meeting with a new oral pain specialist named Dr. Parker. For weeks now, he'd been trying the cold water exercise and the antidepressants, but the jolting pain had only gotten worse. And so he hoped Dr. Parker could finally figure out what was going on here. When Dr. Parker finished up her physical exam of David, she proposed an idea. She thought they should maybe try direct injections to the area that was triggering the pain. She would inject local anesthetic directly into his cheek, into a taut band of skeletal muscle, and maybe get the muscles to relax for a while. She said that should give David some relief. David thought this sounded like a wonderful idea, and he was game to try it. So Dr. Parker readied the anesthetic, then injected it directly into his cheek. The pain of getting this injection was shocking, but David was pretty used to shocking pain by now, so he just gritted his teeth and held still. Once Dr. Parker was done and had removed the needle, at first, David's cheek was just pulsing with pain. But slowly, the pain subsided, and for the first time in months, he just felt normal again. He'd never been so grateful for a moment without pain. Dr. Parker smiled and told David to come back and see her in 2 weeks for another injection. He would need them indefinitely to manage the spasms. David hated the thought of undergoing that treatment twice a month for the foreseeable future, but until doctors could find the root cause of his pain, it was his only course of treatment that actually worked. In January of 2009, David flipped through a magazine in the waiting room at a new medical office. After almost 3 years of finding partial relief through those trigger point injections to his cheek, he had decided to seek help from a new doctor, a neurologist. The injections were still helpful, but they weren't working as well as they did at first. The constant, awful pain in his cheek was back. It was bad during the day, but it got worse when he lay down at night. It made sleeping miserable, leaving David tired all the time. Plus, his insurance only covered part of the injections. At the end of 2018, when he sat down to review his spending for the year, he was shocked by how much he had paid out of pocket for his injections. And so that motivated him to start searching for answers again, because those injections were just band-aids. He needed to find the root cause and fix that. Since the spasms had begun back in 2015, 3 different specialists had told him that the problem was psychological. David wanted to believe them, but he had never been convinced. So he decided to see a neurologist, a doctor who specializes in disorders of the brain. He figured maybe it was a physical problem with his brain, not a mental one. Just then, a nurse called his name, and he followed her back to a sterile, beige-colored room where he sat down on the exam table. Soon after that, a young neurologist knocked on the door and introduced herself as Dr. Bashar. She asked David to walk her through his symptoms. David told her the whole story, about the constant stabbing feeling in his cheek and the limited success he'd had with trigger point injections. Dr. Bashar listened as she began a thorough examination of his face, paying extra attention to the painful spot just to the left of his nose. And when she was done with the exam, she told David that she actually had a whole new diagnosis for him. In her opinion, David had a condition called trigeminal neuralgia, or TN. David had never heard of it. She explained that TN is caused by damage to the trigeminal nerve, which is responsible for carrying sensations like pain from the face to the brain. TN can be triggered by a variety of things: a blood vessel pressing on the nerve, an injury from a sinus surgery or dental work, and in some cases, an unknown cause. But unfortunately, the result is the same. TN is one of the most painful conditions known to medicine. It's called a suicide disease because in the years before doctors were able to help patients manage the pain used to get so intense that some patients would choose to end their own lives rather than deal with the horrible disease. David thought back to how severe his pain had gotten before the trigger point injections he was getting. He couldn't imagine living with that pain for years on end. Dr. Bashar said she needed more information about his condition before she would know how to help him. There was yet another specialist she wanted him to go see. So, a few weeks after his appointment with Dr. Bashar, David was at another neurologist's office, sitting beside a metal cart filled with what looked like computer equipment. It was an electromyography machine, or EMG, that would measure the function of David's face muscles. The neurologist taped numerous electrodes to David's face and then turned on the EMG. Almost immediately, David felt a whole bunch of sharp little electric pulses pricking his skin. But this pain was nothing compared to the face pain he had been experiencing for the last 4 years, so he didn't mind. The machine clicked and pulsed for nearly an hour, and by the end of it, David barely noticed the electric pinpricks. When the EMG finally turned off, David's neurologist removed the electrodes from his face and moved to the EMG monitor to look over the results. He told David there was some good news. His TN was not being caused by a neuromuscular disorder like multiple sclerosis. Unfortunately, though, the EMG did not reveal what was causing it either. David just sighed. After 4 years of disappointing news from specialist after specialist, he had become hopeful after finally getting properly diagnosed that he had TN. And he was now hopeful that this EMG would finally uncover a proper treatment for his pain. But clearly it had not. And so he asked the neurologist if there was anything else he could do. The neurologist paused and then said that typically in this situation, he would opt for brain surgery to help treat David's pain and fix the damaged nerve. But given that David had already had brain surgery to remove the pituitary tumor back in 1997, the neurologist did not feel comfortable recommending another brain surgery. To him, brain surgery should be a true last resort. First, he wanted David to try managing the pain with painkillers. He told him to literally try every one on the market. Two years later, in the winter of 2021, David was once again sitting in a dentist chair, but this time for a routine procedure, a crown replacement. He tried to hold still as his dentist pushed a syringe of Novocaine into his gums, but the needle was triggering his TN and making the numbing process overwhelmingly painful. For the past 2 years, David had been dutifully working his way through a laundry list of painkillers. But instead of getting better, David's pain remained basically constant. In fact, the spasms were so unrelenting that most days he couldn't think straight. He couldn't even meditate anymore, something that had been a daily practice and comfort to him for years. He was frustrated and exhausted with the whole ordeal, and perfectly understood now why TN used to be called the suicide disease. Thankfully, the Novocaine his dentist had given him did eventually set in, and the pain in his cheek finally dulled. It was the first time in a while that there hadn't been pain in his cheek. And so even as his dentist began drilling away at the crown on his back tooth, David simply sat there and enjoyed the temporary relief. But that afternoon, when the Novocaine wore off, the pain came back with a vengeance. He grabbed an ice pack out of the freezer and pressed it to his cheek, hoping it would numb the pain. And it did, a little bit, so that night he literally slept on the ice pack. But it just was not enough. The throbbing pain in his cheek continued. David felt like he was going crazy. He knew that there had to be a proper treatment out there somewhere. A doctor who could figure out what was actually causing his TN and help him fix it. So once again, David started Googling, looking for new specialists to call. A few months later, in June of 2021, David had just wrapped up a lecture when his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was his newest doctor's office. David had been waiting for this call for weeks. After his most recent horrible experience at the dentist, he had made yet another appointment with another neurologist. And after this neurologist thoroughly examined him, they told David something startling. In her opinion, David did not have TN at all. The pain from TN is typically triggered by eating, talking, or brushing your teeth, but none of those activities seemed to trigger David's pain. His pain was a constant presence, regardless of what David was doing. And so this neurologist had ordered an MRI and CT scan to confirm her suspicion. And so now David hoped that on this phone call, he would be given finally a proper diagnosis and treatment plan. David crossed his fingers and answered the call. The neurologist said that after looking over his MRI, she found no abnormality involving his trigeminal nerve. That meant that the earlier diagnosis was incorrect, and David did not have TN. Instead, his CT scan showed that he might have a blockage in a sinus passage located at the back of his nose. She suggested that David's previous doctors had all been looking in the wrong place. She told him to go see another ear, nose, and throat doctor, because if she was right, the answer to David's pain could be a relatively easy fix. David couldn't believe it. After all this time, it seemed too good to be true. And so he promised the neurologist he would contact another ENT right away. Almost 2 years later, in May of 2023, a neurosurgeon named Dr. Sarah Howard stuffed down a quick lunch while reviewing the medical chart for her next patient. She was the director of neurosurgical oncology at a healthcare facility in Santa Barbara, California. And today, she was meeting with David, who had recently retired and moved to the beachside town. Dr. Howard threw her brown lunch bag into the trash, grabbed her tablet, and hurried down the hallway to the exam room where David was waiting. From the moment she entered the room, she could tell that David was on edge. But given how many specialists he had seen over the years, she understood why. David explained that the last doctor he saw was a neurologist back in 2021. That doctor sent him to another ear, nose, and throat specialist to look for a blockage in his sinuses. But the ENT had not found anything wrong, so David felt like he was back to square one after 7 years of looking for answers. Feeling defeated and depressed, David had stopped hoping for a diagnosis at that point, and he had suffered excruciating pain ever since. It had been 7 years since the stabbing pain had started. He just needed it to stop. Dr. Howard brought up the MRI image of David's head that had been taken back in 2021. This was the MRI that supposedly showed he had a sinus blockage rather than TN. She flipped her tablet around so that David could see the image, and then on the image, she pointed at a small spot on his cheek. And while he looked, she told him that she knew exactly how to help him. David looked shocked, but he also tensed up because to this point, nobody seemed to know how to help him. But Dr. Howard seemed very confident, and she told him that the solution was brain surgery. However, because of his complicated medical history, the procedure would be extremely risky and with no guarantees. In fact, she told him there was a 70% chance the surgery would not relieve his pain at all. In fact, it might even make the spasms worse. The last thing Dr. Howard wanted was for David to have unrealistic hopes here and to undergo a risky procedure only to wind up suffering even more than he was now. But Dr. Howard said, look, this is your best chance of relief, but ultimately, the choice is up to you. Dr. Howard waited while David tapped his fingers nervously on his knees, thinking it over. Finally, he asked her to show him the MRI one more time. She handed him the tablet and let him enlarge the scan, looking at that little spot she had pointed out on his cheek. Finally, after staring at the image for several moments, David said he had made up his mind. He was willing to take the risk. It's unclear why David's previous doctor didn't see it on the 2021 MRI scan. But the small spot on David's cheek that Dr. Howard pointed out was a group of blood vessels compressing his left trigeminal nerve. Although she wasn't sure if surgery could correct the condition, the image made her absolutely certain that David did, in fact, have a case of trigeminal neuralgia, or suicide disease, TN. So in that sense, David's earlier doctors had been right. But unlike any of his doctors up to that point, Dr. Howard actually knew how to fix it. In June of 2023, Dr. Howard performed that very risky brain surgery. It's known as a microvascular decompression, and she performed it on the left side of David's head. She drilled a small hole through his skull behind his left ear to expose the trigeminal nerve. Then she slowly lifted away the blood vessels that were pressing on the nerve and stuck a nearly microscopic Teflon pad between the blood vessels and the nerve. That way, the blood vessels could not compress the nerve any longer, and that would theoretically alleviate David's pain. But unfortunately, during the surgery, Dr. Howard hit a snag. She found that some small veins had become entangled with David's trigeminal nerve, making it difficult to completely relieve the pressure. That complication made her worry about how David would feel in the future. Following the surgery, the pain in David's face did diminish, however, it did not go away completely. He also felt intermittent compression behind his ear, which Dr. Howard explained was likely due to nerve scarring, since it had been so many years since the first cheek spasm that was likely caused by these veins. Dr. Howard warned David that compression feeling might end up being permanent. But David finally found his way back to a sense of normalcy, though he wishes he had done more of his own research when the spasms first started happening. He thinks that maybe he would have ended up in a neurosurgeon's office much sooner, saving himself a lot of time, money, and pain. It was mid-June 2014 in Highland Springs, a small blue-collar town about 4 miles outside of Richmond, Virginia. By 3 p.m. that day, it would be hot, 91 degrees Fahrenheit. But right then, at 6:30 in the morning, it was cool. With the sun fully visible in the sky, 16-year-old Martre Coles watched from the living room window of his family's single-story plain white house as his father climbed into his car, turned on his engine, and drove off to work. After he was gone, Martre left the window and walked through the empty house to his bedroom. Once inside, he sat down at his desk, he opened his sketchbook, and he started to draw. Unlike his usual artwork, which consisted of anime-stylized faces and figures full of color, energy, and movement, the faces that he drew that morning were done in thick black marker and were angry and sad. He drew X's instead of eyes, and he put slash marks where the mouths should go. A few minutes later, Martre put down the marker, he put his face in his hands, and he started to cry. 5 days earlier, on June 14, 2014, Martre's beloved mother, 42-year-old Karina Coles, had died unexpectedly following complications from what was supposed to be routine hip surgery. Martre was beyond devastated. Over the last few years, he had become very close with his mother, as he was the last child of 8 siblings to still be living at home with the parents. His father, Maurice, had always been very hard on him, but his mother had always been his #1 cheerleader, always encouraging him to keep a portfolio of the video game characters and intricately illustrated storylines that he loved to create. She told him she was certain his artwork skills would land him a great job someday. And even though Martre didn't always feel as confident in himself as she did, it was nice to hear her say things like that. With his mother's funeral just 2 days away, the only thing keeping Martre going was the thought that his mom would never want him to just give up or to give in to the crushing depression and sadness he was feeling. And so Martre lifted his face out of his hands, he wiped away his tears, then he ripped the angry, sad drawings he had just made out of his sketchbook and he balled it up and he threw it in the trash. He wished he could talk to his dad about how terrible he was feeling right now, but he knew his dad wouldn't want to listen. He never did. Martre's father barely spoke to him, and whenever he did, it was almost always to be critical of him. As Martre sat there motionless in his desk seat, he suddenly hoped that his father's friend, a 45-year-old woman named Denise Gay, wouldn't be coming by again that night. Denise worked with Martre's dad at a food packaging company called Smithfield Foods. She had 2 children of her own, a 9-year-old little girl and a 19-year-old daughter who lived on her own 90 minutes away. Martre had no issue with Denise herself. She was perfectly nice, but Martre just didn't like that there was this new woman spending time in their house so soon after his mom had died. It just felt inappropriate. Martre had also quietly hoped that his mother's death would bring him and his father closer together, but the opposite was happening. Instead of turning to his son in this difficult time, Maurice was turning more and more to Denise. By June 21st, just 1 week after Martre's mother's death, Denise was coming over their house nearly every night. And in mid-July, just 1 month after Martre's mother's death, Maurice announced to Martre and his other siblings that Denise, along with her 9-year-old daughter Alana, were going to be moving in with him and with Martre. Despite protests from Martre's older sisters, Michelle and Marquisha, that their father's relationship was progressing way too fast, and that Martre was still very emotionally fragile following his mother's death, Maurice had made up his mind. He didn't care what Martre's feelings about the situation were. A couple days later, when Denise and Alana pulled up outside of Martre's house with their bags in hand, Martre stayed inside. He didn't want to see them. But his father began angrily yelling for him to come outside and meet his new family and help his stepsister with her luggage. Martre sighed and stood up and walked outside. He didn't smile at them, but he waved, and then he walked over to Alana to offer to carry her bag inside. But when he reached her, she clutched her bag more tightly to her chest. Then she glared at him angrily, and then she very intentionally threw her bag at his feet. Martre was annoyed, and he looked up at her like, "What are you doing?" But he didn't say anything. He just bent down, grabbed her bag, and then led the way back into the house. Later that day, Martre's older sisters called him to let him know that he was welcome to stay with them anytime he wanted. They knew his new living situation with Denise and Alana was going to be super awkward, and they knew Martre was just hurting from the death of their mother and he really needed someone around him that actually cared about him. Martre thanked them and said, "Yep, sure, I'll come by sometime," but secretly, Martre knew he probably wouldn't. He just didn't have the energy to do anything these days. According to Martre's girlfriend, Ashlyn Knight, who was a fellow student at Highland Springs High School, Martre had big plans for his future, plans that his mother had encouraged him to pursue. Martre wanted to get into the best art school he possibly could, and then with that degree, he could try to land a highly coveted job as a video game artist and animator. And so over the first few months that Denise and Alana were living with him, Martre did his best to completely ignore them and instead spend his time and energy on his artwork. And over those first few months, Martre's art skills got noticeably better, and he started branching out from drawing and painting into the creation of elaborate and beautiful papier-mâché masks. But perhaps the most significant thing about this particular period of time in Martre's life was that after about 6 months of living with Denise, his resentment for her had given way to affection. She could never replace his mother, but she was very kind to him, and slowly, she had become a maternal figure to him. She had become someone he turned to when he was down. However, as much as Martre's relationship with Denise seemed to be evolving in a positive way, his relationship with her daughter Alana was going the other direction. Alana was clearly unhappy living with the Coles, and so she took out her frustration by constantly picking fights with Martre. At first, it was just small stuff like stealing the TV remote from Martre or being loud and obnoxious to annoy him. But eventually, it turned into more elaborate torment. Specifically, Alana realized that Maurice, Martre's father, would always take her side over his son's. And so using that information, she began breaking things around the house and telling Maurice that Martre did it. And every time, despite Martre proclaiming his innocence, Maurice would scream and yell at him and punish him in some way. Alana also quickly realized how important Martre's art was to him, and so she would routinely sneak into his room and vandalize his sketches and his masks. Martre had tried turning to Denise for help, but he was finding that she seemed to be in denial about how badly behaved her daughter really was. Martre also sensed that Denise was desperate to maintain her relationship with his father, and so she probably didn't want to fully acknowledge just how bad it was getting between he and Alana, because doing that would call their entire living arrangement into question, which would potentially jeopardize their future together as a cohesive family. And so Denise really didn't do anything to stop her daughter. Finally, in the winter of 2016, so 2 years after Denise and Alana had moved in, the tension in the household boiled over into violence. Early one afternoon, when Maurice and Denise were still at work, and Martre was sitting on the couch in the living room, Alana slipped into the kitchen, she opened the utensil drawer, and she pulled out a pair of utility scissors with long pointed blades. And then the 12-year-old walked back into the living room where Martre was, and she snuck up behind him, she pulled out the scissors, and then she leapt around the corner and she jumped on top of him and attempted to stab him in the heart. And Martre, at the last second, reached up and kind of pushed her arm out of the way, but the blades dug into his left shoulder and they went in deep. Martre's girlfriend, Ashlyn, remembers the very angry call she got from Martre that night after Denise had cleaned and bandaged the wound on his shoulder and had apologized on behalf of Alana, but that was it. And so for Martre, this was the breaking point. He was furious that his father and Denise had just totally let the situation with Alana get completely out of control, and he was just kind of scared of Alana. That was a real attack on him. And so as he talked to Ashlyn that night, he said to her, I really need to start actually focusing on how I'm going to execute my plan and actually get into art school and get out of this insane household and go pursue my dreams. And Ashlyn agreed, and she encouraged him and said, yes, go do that. And so in mid-December 2016, Martre worked up the courage to go approach his father and ask him if he would sit down with Martre and try to fill out some financial paperwork that would help him get funding to go to college. And as he's trying to explain to his dad why he needs this funding and what he's going to do with his degree, Maurice, his dad, just kind of puts his hand up and says, you know what? I didn't go to college. I don't understand any of this stuff. You're on your own, kid. Martre was kind of crushed because he needed his dad to fill in the paperwork to be eligible for financial aid. But luckily, Denise was sitting nearby. She had overheard the conversation, and after Maurice had left the room, she pulled Martre aside and said, you know what, don't worry about it. I will get the information you need. I'll help you fill it out. We'll get you into college. You'll be fine. And so over the next few months, with Denise's help and encouragement, Martre not only filled out the financial aid paperwork, but he also sent out applications and letters of inquiry to various art colleges. And then, in March of 2017, roughly 3 years since his mother had died, Martre received the best news he had ever gotten. On March 4th at 4:17 in the afternoon, while Martre worked at his computer, he heard the ping of an incoming email. One click later, and he was reading an invitation from Full Sail University, an art school in Florida, asking him if he would like to come take a personalized tour of their campus. The administrator who had sent the email, Sheila Crenshaw, told Martre that she and her staff had been very impressed with the pictures of his artwork that he had sent along, and so they would love to get to know him and see if the school was a good fit. Sheila told Martre that if he wanted to come and do this tour, to be sure to bring along at least one of his papier-mâché masks, as well as his portfolio of drawings. Martre was so excited, he leapt from his chair and he ran into the room next door where Denise was, and after telling her the good news, she jumped up too, and the pair laughed and hugged and talked about how it was really happening. Martre was really going to go to art school and pursue his dreams. After they calmed down, Denise booked Martre a seat on a bus that would take him from Richmond, Virginia to Florida on Sunday, March 12th. The tour was scheduled for the following Monday. After his travel was booked, Martre realized he only had 8 days until he would be leaving, so right away he got to work making a special papier-mâché mask that he would bring along. He wanted to make sure he really impressed the Full Sail staff. On March 11th, the night before Martre was scheduled to ride out to Florida, Martre stayed with his older sister Michelle at her house. They spent the evening excitedly talking about his potential future at Full Sail and how happy this invitation would have made their mother, whose birthday was coming up later that month. The next morning, Michelle and Martre hopped in Michelle's car, and she began driving toward Martre's house. Their dad had agreed to give Martre a ride to the bus station later that day. When they arrived, Michelle gave her brother a big hug, she wished him good luck, and told him to text her as soon as he got to Florida, and he said he would. After Michelle got back in her car and she began to drive to work, she felt a profound sense of relief wash over her. She knew her little brother still missed their mother terribly, and even talked about his own death and how, at least when that happened, he would be with their mom. But finally, this invitation to Full Sail seemed like the break he so desperately needed. When Martre walked into his house that morning, Denise and her older daughter, Latoya, were both in the kitchen chatting and drinking coffee. When Denise saw Martre, she told him that his dad had apparently got called into work that day, so he couldn't give him a ride to the bus stop. However, she and her daughter didn't mind. He thanked them, and then he sat down with them, and for a few minutes the trio drank their coffee and chatted about Full Sail and other things. And then eventually, Martre told them that he still needed to pack, so he got up and he headed to his bedroom. As he got his clothes and his papier-mâché mask and other artwork together, he smiled. In less than an hour, he'd be on a bus headed to Florida, and he'd be officially pursuing his dreams. Since Martre's girlfriend, Ashlyn, had known she would not see Martre in person before he left for Florida, and they both knew that Martre might not be able to charge his phone during the 18-hour-long bus ride, they had arranged for Martre to text her as soon as he got on the bus so she could say goodbye. But at the time Martre should have been on the bus texting her, he didn't. He didn't text, he didn't call, it was just silent. And over the course of the morning, despite Ashlyn calling and texting him repeatedly, Martre never responded. Around noon, Ashlyn called Martre's sisters, Michelle and Marquisha, asking if they had heard from their brother, and they said no. By late afternoon, when still there was silence from Martre, Ashlyn, Michelle, and Marquisha were becoming frantic. They all knew that even 3 years after his mother's death, Martre still suffered occasional deep bouts of depression when he started thinking about his mom. And so the 3 young women started worrying that he might have harmed himself. That's why they're not hearing from him. So at 4 p.m. that afternoon, Martre's sisters rushed to their father's house to see what their father and Denise knew. And when they got there, they met up with Denise and LaToya, who were out in the front yard. And after listening to Martre's sisters, Denise was stunned. She had been with Martre that morning. She had seen him leave. What could have happened? How could anything be wrong? But when Maurice, who at some point had come outside to see what was going on, heard the news, he was completely unconcerned that his son seemed to have just vanished right off the face of the earth. He told his daughters that Martre hadn't even been gone long enough to have reached Florida. It was an 18-hour trip. He probably was just asleep on the bus. And if he didn't show up at school tomorrow for the tour, well, Martre was 19 years old. He was an adult, so whatever he wanted to do, that was on him. Completely unsettled by their father's utter indifference about this, Martre's sisters left the house and met up with Ashlyn, who was now hysterical. After they calmed her down, the 3 women eventually decided that their best bet right now was just to search the neighborhood for Martre. Denise said she had dropped him off at the bus stop, but she didn't actually see him get on the bus and literally drive away. So the 3 young women are thinking, okay, well, maybe Martre never got on the bus. Maybe he's still in town somewhere. So the trio spread out all across Highland Springs. They went to local stores, to the high school, to the basketball court. They called and texted all of Martre's friends, but no one had seen or heard from Martre. The next morning, Monday, March 13th, they called Full Sail University to see if Martre had arrived for his tour, and the answer was no. Immediately, Michelle and Marquisha jumped in their car and they headed for the local police station where they filed a missing persons report on their brother. They gave the police a picture and description of Martre, but police told them that because Martre was an adult and there was no sign of foul play, there really wasn't much they could do. Meanwhile, Martre's girlfriend, Ashlyn, who knew Martre's email password, decided to take a closer look at Martre's invitation from Full Sail University. When he had shown it to her 10 days earlier, she had noticed something slightly off about it, but she had forgotten all about it once they had read the good news and were celebrating. But now, when she logged into his email account and opened up the invitation again, she immediately saw why she thought the email was concerning. The email had not been sent from an official Full Sail University account. Instead, it had come from someone's personal Gmail account, a woman named Sheila Crenshaw. Ashlyn pulled out her cell phone and she called Full Sail again. And a few minutes later, Ashlyn's worst fears were confirmed. No one by that name worked at the university. But shockingly, when Martre's father, Maurice, was told about this new wrinkle about the email address and how this meant Martre was almost certainly tricked or scammed before he went missing, Maurice still appeared unconcerned, and he refused to reach out to the police himself. 8 days later, Martre's mother's birthday came and went, and still there was no trace of Martre. Since their mother's death, all of the siblings started getting together on her birthdays to celebrate her life and spend time together. And Martre cherished these get-togethers. So for him not to at least text or call his family on her birthday was very significant. It was starting to feel almost likely that he had taken his own life. But just a week later, everything would change. On April 2nd, 2017, 3 weeks after Martre was reported missing, a man named Larry Anderson was walking in a wooded area near where the Coles lived when he spotted a strange green plastic bin tucked away inside of a thick bush. He walked off of the trail to get a better look at it, but when he got close enough to actually see what was inside of this bin, he stopped where he was, he pulled out his phone, and he dialed 911. When the police arrived, they found Larry, who was visibly very shaken up, and he was pacing along the trail a couple hundred feet away, and then the police moved from Larry to the actual bin under the bush, and when they got up close, they saw what Larry saw. There was clearly a foot with a sneaker on it poking out of the bin. When they removed the cover of the bin completely and actually got a full view inside, they saw the dead body of a young man folded up like an accordion, crammed inside. He was wearing blue jeans and he had a dark sweatshirt on. His knees were jackknifed up against his chest at an impossible angle, and his hands were bound behind his back with purple duct tape. There were no obvious wounds on his body. However, an autopsy would later reveal that the cause of his death was suffocation. The medical examiner also told police that present in the blood were high levels of two drugs, the sleep agent trazodone and the club drug gamma-butyrolactone, which makes users feel relaxed and euphoric. Even though there was no wallet or ID on this body, when detectives ran a general description of the young man's appearance through their database, right away they found a match to a missing person report that had been filed 3 weeks earlier on March 13th. The deceased young man inside of the storage bin was Martre Coles. Before the police told Martre's family the horrible news, they received a surprising phone call from another police sergeant. He had heard about the murder, and he had just connected Martre's name and his address to a false burglar alarm that 2 of his officers had responded to on March 31st, which was 2 days before Martre's body was discovered. After following up on this very bizarre connection the sergeant had made, and using evidence they had found at the scene where Martre's body was discovered, police were able to slowly, bit by bit, piece together the story of who killed Martre and why. Back on Friday, March 31st, so 2 days before Martre was found, that sergeant's 2 police officers responded to a burglar alarm at Martre's home. When they arrived at Martre's home, Alana came to the door. Standing next to her was her older sister, Latoya. Now, neither of these 2 responding officers had any idea that there was a missing person report out on another member of their family. Latoya told the officers that she was really sorry that the burglar alarm they were responding to was actually a false alarm. She told them, while glaring down at her sister Alana, that her younger sister had deliberately set the alarm off and she was about to be punished for it. The police asked a few more questions, and then feeling satisfied that this really was just a false alarm because this kid pulled it, they turned around to leave. But before they did, Alana suddenly blurted out, "Can I talk to you guys, please, alone?" And then Alana promptly stepped forward away from her sister out of the house into the evening darkness, and she and one of the officers walked over to the police car they had come in on, while the other police officer stayed put at the door with Latoya, keeping her from going out there. Once Alana was far enough away that she didn't think Latoya or any of her other family members in the house could hear her, she turned to the officer and told him a story that was so outrageous and so unexpected that it just did not seem true. And so after Alana was done telling this story and had gone back inside with Latoya and the door had shut and the 2 responding officers said bye and they were leaving, they discussed it in the car, those 2 officers, and they decided there's no way that could be true. And so when they got back to the station, they filed their report as usual, describing that this was a false alarm, and then they also wrote down in this report what Alana told them, her crazy story, but they didn't alert anyone to this story. They just basically made a note of it, and then they filed their report with their sergeant and thought nothing of it. 3 days later, when their sergeant learned that the murder victim found in the storage bin was Alana's stepbrother, the sergeant suddenly remembered the report and realized the story Alana had told his officers might actually be true. Based on a combination of Alana's story, along with other pieces of evidence that the police collected, the following is a reconstruction of what actually happened to Martre. Back on the morning of Sunday, March 12th, so the day Martre was scheduled to take the bus to Florida, his older sister Michelle dropped him back off in front of his house and gave him a hug before she left for work. When Martre walked through the front doors into his house, Denise and her daughter Latoya were sitting in the kitchen. Martre sat down, and as the trio chatted, Martre didn't realize the cup of coffee he was drinking was almost certainly laced with the 2 drugs that the medical examiner would later find in his system, trazodone and gamma-butyrolactone. By the time Martre got up from the table and headed to his bedroom to pack for his trip to the college, the drugs would have likely begun taking effect. As he stepped into his bedroom, he likely would have started to wonder why he was feeling so crushingly tired and lethargic. He also was probably wondering why Denise and Latoya had followed him into his room and pushed his door most of the way closed without saying a word. Across the hall, Alana was in her room when she heard a loud shout. The voice was weak, but the words were clear. "Get off of me!" She recognized the voice as Martre's. She stepped out of her bedroom and pushed the door of Martre's room open a little to see what was going on, and what she saw was Martre on his back on the ground, and her mother, Denise, standing over his head while kind of bent forward. She was pressing her hands directly down onto his chest, basically putting all of her weight onto his chest, crushing him. Alana's sister, Latoya, was sitting on Martre's legs trying to hold them down because Martre was kicking her and trying to get up. As Martre continued to yell out for them to get off of him, his voice became weaker and weaker as he wasn't able to fully expand his chest to get a full breath because Denise was crushing his chest. Suddenly, Denise looked up and she saw Alana standing in the doorway. Without releasing the pressure on Martre's chest, she simply said to Alana in an unnaturally calm voice, "Nothing is happening. Go back to your room." Alana, who had learned over the years that it was a bad idea to cross her mother, did what she was told, and she kind of backed out into the hallway, and then a few steps more and she was behind her closed bedroom door, her heart pounding wildly. Back inside of Martre's room, Denise was starting to panic. She wished Alana hadn't seen, but now if she didn't finish Martre off, his yells for help, as weak as they were, might alert others. So while keeping the pressure firmly applied to his chest, Denise looked around and saw the papier-mâché mask Martre had so carefully made for his trip to the college laying on the ground near them. She took one hand off of his chest, so she's still pressing with the other, and she reached and she picked the mask up, and then she placed it over Martre's face, completely blocking his nose and mouth, and then began pressing down on his face as well. Then she leaned forward and put her knee into the center of his chest, right on his sternum, and put all of her weight onto her knee, and then she shifted the hand that had been on his chest up to his throat, and she began pressing as hard as she could on his throat. And so she maintained all 3 points of pressure, his chest, his neck, and his face, until Martre stopped moving. A few minutes later, across the hall in her bedroom, Alana heard the sound of something plastic being dragged over the floor. Although terrified, she opened her bedroom door just enough to look into the hallway, and this time she saw her sister Latoya pulling a large, heavy green storage bin across the floor. A few minutes later, Alana looked out her bedroom window, and she saw her mother and sister hoist this green tub into the back of Denise's car, and then the 2 of them drove away. After they were gone, Alana quietly closed the door to her bedroom, and then she sat on her bed, and she's thinking to herself, this has to be a dream. This can't be real. But then later that day, when Martre's sisters came over to their house in a total panic, saying that Martre wasn't responding to any texts or calls and we think he's missing, that's when Alana knew this had not been a dream. What she had just seen had really happened. Over the next few days, Alana kept hoping that Martre would just show up, that he'd walk through the door and that everything would go back to normal. But that didn't happen. And 19 days later, on March 31st, Alana was unable to carry this secret any longer. And so she waited until dark, and then she intentionally set off the family burglar alarm, knowing it would trigger police to come to her house, and then she could tell them her secret. When Alana stepped outside of the house to talk privately to one of the responding police officers, their conversation was captured on body camera. She turned her face up towards the officer and whispered 7 words that would blow this murder case wide open. I saw my mom kill my stepbrother. It would turn out Denise had decided a long time ago that the only way to really secure her relationship with Maurice and to create the family she wanted was to get rid of any reminders of Maurice's dead wife. And Martre, with his mother's wide smile and many of her mannerisms, had done everything he could to keep his mother's memory alive. Even his depression over her loss only reminded everyone how much she had meant to her family. Denise was also worried that Maurice might begin to see her own daughter, Alana, as a liability because of the constant bickering between her and Martre. So when Denise overheard Martre talking to his father about trying to secure financial aid so he could go off to art college, she saw an opportunity to make him disappear from her life altogether. That email Martre received inviting him to Full Sail University had not been sent by the college. It had been sent by Denise, who was sitting right in the next room on her laptop. And before sending that email, Denise had actually called and texted her older daughter, Latoya, and explained her plan for killing Martre, and she asked Latoya to help her, and she agreed. On April 3rd, one day after Martre's body was found, the detectives working on the murder case were getting ready to inform Martre's family that he was dead. But when the sergeant, whose officers had spoken to Alana, called to tell those investigators what Alana had said about her mother's involvement in Martre's murder, the detectives decided to hold off telling Martre's family that he was dead. If, in fact, Martre's murderer was someone inside of his own family in his own house, police did not want to tip them off by telling them that they had discovered Martre's body. Instead, investigators dug into Denise's background and they found a long history of felonies, from passing worthless checks to charges of computer fraud that had landed her in jail more than once. Then, under the guise of following up on Martre's missing person report, police returned to the Coles house to interview Maurice, Denise, and Latoya again. This time, police pressured Latoya and her mom for any information they might have about Martre's whereabouts, hoping that maybe the murderer would get spooked and do something suspicious or incriminating. At the same time, police put the green storage container that had held Martre's body back where it was first discovered in the park. Then they set up video cameras to record any activity around it. And within days, both Latoya and her mother Denise were spotted returning to the wooded area where they had left Martre's body, and much to their shock, finding the bin now empty. Police also discovered that shortly before Martre's disappearance, Denise had purchased a shovel, purple duct tape, and a substance called lime that can be used to prevent decomposition of human flesh. But most damning of all, cell phone and computer records confirmed that both Denise and Latoya had been to the wooded park on March 12th, the day Martre went missing, and these records confirmed that Denise was definitely the author of the email from Full Sail University. It was that invitation, the most promising and exciting event in Martre's life that his mother would have been so proud of him for, that lured him to his death. On July 11th, 2018, 49-year-old Denise Gay was sentenced to life in prison. Her daughter, 23-year-old Latoya Gay, was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Despite being a less than stellar parent, Maurice Coles had nothing to do with his son's death. In 2018, a 56-year-old father of four named Tayeb Suyami was living in a quiet, modest town in New Jersey called Little Ferry. Tayeb had moved to the United States from Africa back in 1996, and after getting settled in New Jersey, he had landed a job as an accountant for a food importing company. At first, Tayeb's salary had been enough to provide for the family, but as his family grew, his salary just wasn't enough, and money became a real problem. And so eventually, Tayeb's wife also got a full-time job, but even then, with two full-time working adults, the family had to stay on a very strict budget just to make ends meet. And that year, in 2018, one of Tayeb's daughters was getting ready to go to college, and so Tayeb was forced to refinance his mortgage just to make the initial payments on his child's college bills. But despite his financial struggles, Tayeb did not let it bother him. He was an eternal optimist who fundamentally believed that in the end, everything would just work itself out. On May 1st of that year, Tayeb was on his way home from work when his wife called him and asked if he would swing by the grocery store and pick up some orange juice. So Tayyab stopped at the ShopRite grocery store in Hackensack, New Jersey, which was only a couple miles north of Little Ferry where they lived. And he went inside, he went to the juice aisle, and he scanned the different brands of orange juice. And at some point, he grabbed the most appealing orange juice that was still within their budget. It was $5. He takes the juice, he goes to the front of the store, he pays for it, he goes outside, he hops in his car, and he heads home. When he pulls into his driveway, he gets out, he goes into the house, he goes right into the kitchen where his wife was, and he proudly set the orange juice down on the kitchen table, expecting a thank you from his wife. But his wife turned around and she looked at the orange juice and she saw the brand he had purchased, and she immediately said, "How much did you pay for that?" And Tayyab said, $5. And she said, "Well, you got to take it back because I know that brand is on sale for $2.50 at the grocery store right down the road, so go return this one." And so Tayyab was totally annoyed because he just got home from work. He thought he had done a good deed and now he's in trouble. And so he decided, you know what? I'm not going to fight her on this. He just walked over, grabbed the $5 orange juice, and he went back outside, hopped in his car, and took off. A few minutes later, he arrived at the Hackensack, New Jersey ShopRite. He went inside and he went straight to the customer service desk where there was a teenager behind the counter. And Tayyab walked over to them and he handed them the juice along with his receipt, and he asked for a refund. And so while Tayyab is standing there letting this cashier complete the transaction, he looked behind the cashier at the wall, and there was this sign that totally piqued his interest. And so he's staring at the sign, and then finally the teenage cashier, he finishes the transaction and he reaches out across the counter with Tayyab's $5. And Tayyab, he reaches out and he takes the $5, but then he pauses for a second. And he's kind of looking up at the sign and he's thinking about what he should do. And he knows that if he does this, if he does what the sign is telling him to do, he's going to get in trouble with his wife because this is the exact opposite of what he was sent out to do. But Tayyab just couldn't help it, and he takes the $5 and he proceeds to hand it right back to the cashier, and he tells the cashier what he wants him to do with it. And so a couple minutes later, Tayyab leaves the ShopRite with no juice, with no $5, but 2 small slips of paper in his back pocket. And so Tayyab hops in his car and he drives to the grocery store that's right down the road from their house. He goes inside and he gets the on sale $2.50 bottle of orange juice. And then he goes back into his car, he drives home, he goes in the kitchen and he sets the juice on the counter and tells his wife, "Yep, I got the right one, $2.50. And he's just hoping the whole time that she has not checked the bank account and has not discovered what he had really been doing while he was out, because he had actually spent more money on the second trip than the first time. But apparently his wife had not checked the account yet, and she just thanked him for being willing to go out and get the better deal. And so Tayyab very happily left the kitchen, and he spent the rest of the night watching TV and hanging out with his family. And then early the next morning, Tayyab got up and he decided, you know what? I need to do something to curry some favor with my wife because she's gonna learn what I did with the refund money pretty soon. And so he decided he would just go out and do a bunch of yard work that day, right in front of his wife, to make sure she really saw that he was doing some good stuff. And so he goes outside, he opens up the garage, and he's about to pull the lawnmower out when he notices his car is really dirty. And so he decides, you know what, I'm gonna go wash my car first and then come back and cut the grass and do some other things. And so he goes inside and he tells his wife what his plan is. And she says, okay, I'll see you in a little bit when you come back from the car wash. And then Tayyab went back outside, he hopped in his car, and he left. As he was driving to the car wash, he made a pit stop at a small store that was set back off the road. And so he goes inside and he goes right to the back of this little store where there's this strange machine that looks like an ATM, and it has a screen on it with text scrolling across it. And at the bottom, there was an opening where a barcode scanner was kind of projecting down. And so Tayyab walks up to this machine and he reaches into his back pocket and he pulls out those 2 slips of paper he had got from the grocery store cashier the night before, and he puts the first one under the scanner, and then he reads the text that appears on the screen of this machine. And after reading it, he kind of shrugs his shoulders and puts that piece of paper back in his pocket. And then the second slip of paper he puts into the scanner. And then when he reads the words that pop up on the screen, he thinks there's been a mistake because all it says is "see receptionist." And so he rescans the second slip of paper to see if something different will happen. But sure enough, again, it just says "see receptionist." And so he pulls the second slip of paper out of the scanner, he turns around and he walks to the front of the store and he hands the paper to the woman behind the counter. Over an hour later, Tayyab pulled into his driveway, and he sat in his driveway for a second. He was still shaking from what had just happened inside of that small store. And so he gets out of his car, which was still totally dirty, and he made his way into the house, and he went straight to the kitchen where his wife was. And so as soon as he gets in the kitchen, his wife turns around and looks at him and says, "Where were you? The car wash is like 5 minutes away. Why were you gone for like 2 hours?" But Tayyab, he's got no expression on his face, and he looks at his wife and just says, "Give me $100. And his wife scrunches her face up at him and says, "No, where's your money?" And Tayyab smiles, he turns around, he reaches into his back pocket, and he pulls out that second slip of paper, and he hands it to his wife, and he says, "Here's my money." After getting that $5 refund at the ShopRite in Hackensack, New Jersey, Tayyab noticed a sign on the back wall that was advertising for a Moneyball jackpot lottery. And he had decided to use the $5 refund to buy 2 lottery tickets. And so he buys these 2 lottery tickets, and the next day, that store set back off the road he went to was a convenience store, a 7-Eleven, and the machine he was using was a machine that scanned your lottery tickets to see if they were winners. And so the first ticket he scanned, it was a dud, it didn't win anything. But the second ticket, when he scanned it, it couldn't process the amount of money he had just won. And so that's why it told him to see the receptionist. And so he brought the second ticket up to the counter, he handed it to the woman, and after she scanned it and saw the amount of money he had won, all she could do was say, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God." And when he asked her, "What are you looking at? What happened?" She just goes, "Big." And so when he got home, Tayyab handed that slip to his wife, and on it was the amount of money that he had won. He was the jackpot winner. He had won $315 million. Tayyab would say that he and his wife and his kids all laughed and cried and celebrated in the kitchen all night, and within a couple of days, Tayyab had left his job, he retired, and he had paid off all of his family's debts. And at his press conference for the New Jersey lottery, he was quoted as saying, "I love orange juice now." Our next story is called Overcoming Adversity. In 1959, Ronald McNair was a very gifted 9-year-old African-American boy living in South Carolina. While he was good at virtually everything he tried, from music to athletics to schoolwork, the only thing that ever really grabbed his attention was outer space. And so as a 9-year-old child, he made the decision that one day he was going to become an astronaut. But he had no idea how to become an astronaut. And so he decided the first thing he would do would be to go to his library and take out some books on NASA, the very famous organization that sends American astronauts to space. However, there was an issue with his plan. This library only served white patrons. It was a segregated library. Ronald knew this, but he figured, you know what? I'm a polite kid. I can get in there and get out before anybody notices me. But as soon as he walked into that library, everybody in there, who were all white, just stared at Ronald. Ronald could feel it, but he just kept his head down and he walked through the library. He got to the science section, he grabbed a couple books he wanted, and then he walked back to the counter and he put them up, and he very politely asked the librarian, who was also white, if he could check these books out. And this librarian looks at him and says, "Young man, you better get out of here before I call the police." And Ronald, at this point, looks up at the librarian and thinks for a second, and then just hops up onto her counter and sits there and says, "Okay, I'll wait for the police." The librarian was totally outraged and would call the police and would call Ronald's mother. And before long, the police did show up, and it was 2 white guys. They come inside, and this librarian runs over to them, and she's talking to them, and she's pointing back over at Ronald, gesticulating that very clearly Ronald is the issue. That's why you've been called here. And the officers would be just totally annoyed by this librarian. And they would say to her, "Why don't you just let the kid take the books out?" And the librarian was totally offended at this and began defending her decision to call the police instead of letting him take the books out. And as she's defending herself, Ronald's mother comes running into the library. She runs over to her son to make sure he's okay. And then she looks up at the police officers and this librarian to try to figure out what's going on. And at this point, the police officers are just totally over it. And they turn to the librarian and they say, "You know what? You really ought to let him take the books out." And then the officers just turned around and left. The librarian was not about to just let him take the books. She was still very upset. And so she storms over to Ronald's mother and she says to her, "You shouldn't let your son come in here." And at this, Ronald's mother is looking at this librarian who's totally upset, and she looks down at her son who's got his head down, and then she notices the few books on the counter about space, and she was aware of Ronald's love for outer space, and she put together what had happened. And after thinking about it for a moment, she looks up at this librarian, and she just says, "Well, since he's here already, can he take out those books? He'll take good care of them." The librarian is still totally furious, but knows this is a losing fight, and so very reluctantly, with a scowl on her face, she grabs the books and she jams them into Ronald's arms. And Ronald's mother nudges Ronald and says, "What do you say?" And Ronald, while holding all of his new books about NASA and space, looks up at the librarian and smiles and says, "Thank you, ma'am." And then he and his mom turn around and they leave. Ronald would go on to earn his PhD in physics from MIT, one of the most prestigious universities in the world, and after graduation, he was picked up by NASA to become an astronaut. And in 1984, Ronald went into outer space. He was actually the second African American to ever go into outer space. And while he was in orbit, apparently he played his saxophone for his crew. And then in 1986, Ronald was chosen again to go on another mission to outer space, but tragically, 73 seconds after takeoff, their space shuttle, the Challenger, exploded, killing Ronald and the 6 other astronauts on board. Following his death, the library in South Carolina that had tried to turn Ronald away for his skin color renamed themselves the Ronald McNair Life History Center. Our next story is called Cowboy. In 1963, when Tim Dick was just 10 years old, he went over to his friend's house and he snuck a bottle of whiskey from one of their shelves. He pulled it out and he poured himself a full glass to the brim with whiskey, and then he downed it in one huge gulp. Tim had grown up idolizing cowboys on TV, and every time he watched them, they would come galloping into some town, they would go into the saloon, and they would sit at the bar just throwing back shots of whiskey. And so Tim always assumed whiskey must be this totally amazing, refreshing drink for these guys to be drinking it out in the heat of the desert. But unfortunately for Tim, after he slugged this huge glass of whiskey, it was not refreshing. It tasted like gasoline, and his chest felt like it was on fire. But instead of being turned off by alcohol and waiting until he was older and of age to try it again, Tim instead thought, you know what? The next time I have whiskey, I just need to water it down a little bit. And so for the next year, Tim continued to periodically sneak whiskey out of his friends' cabinets, and he would drink this watered down whiskey. And then when he turned 11 years old, his father, who he was very close with, died tragically in a car accident. And Tim really didn't have a good way to cope with the grief of losing his father, and so he turned to drinking even more than he already was. And before long, Tim was like this young kid who basically was an alcoholic. But he hid it extremely well. He graduated high school, he graduated college, and really nobody knew he was drinking as much as he was. But after he graduated college and he was living on his own in Michigan, there was no structure in place or person in place to stop Tim from going overboard with his substance abuse. And so not only did his drinking get completely out of control, but he began using and selling drugs, namely cocaine. In 1978, when Tim was 25 years old, he and his drug dealing partner were scheduled to take part in the biggest drug deal of their careers. They would be selling about 1.5 pounds of cocaine to a guy named Michael Pfeiffer, and he'd be buying it for $42,000, which when you adjust that for inflation would be like buying it for $175,000 in 2021. Tim and his partner were very excited about all this money they were going to make, but they were equally worried about the transaction. A lot can go wrong. And so Tim decided, in order to mitigate their nerves and kind of make this a safer drug deal, he decided they would do the transaction inside of a public airport, because Tim had seen that done on TV and believed that would give them an additional layer of safety. And so on the day this deal is going to take place, Tim takes the 1.5 pounds of cocaine, he puts it inside of a brown Adidas gym bag, and he also throws a key lock inside of this bag. He zips it up, he walks outside, he dumps the bag in the back of his car, and he drives to the Kalamazoo International Airport in Michigan. When he gets there, he parks in the big parking lot right outside of the front doors. And as soon as he's parked, he goes around to the back of his car. He pulls out this brown Adidas bag. He throws it over his shoulder, shuts his trunk, and then he waits for his partner to show up. A couple of minutes later, right on time, his partner pulls into the lot. He parks nearby. And then the two of them very casually begin walking towards the front doors of this airport. They walk up the steps, they go in the front doors, and as soon as they're inside, they're looking around and they find Michael Pfeiffer. He's standing up against the wall right in the area he had said he would be. And so without making any sort of contact with Michael, Tim and his partner turn the corner and they go into a nearby locker room. Once they're inside, Tim pulls the lock out of the brown bag and then he puts the bag with the drugs in it inside of a locker. He shuts it and then uses the lock he had just pulled out to lock the locker. And then he and his partner leave the locker room. As soon as they go out into the main terminal, they start walking over towards Michael Pfeiffer. And as they get closer and closer, Tim's partner breaks off and goes to a bench on the other side of the terminal. And Tim continues walking on right up to Michael. And then when he reaches Michael, he very discreetly hands him the key to the lock on the locker. And he tells him which locker number the drugs are in. Michael doesn't say anything. He takes the key and he heads off to the locker room. Tim turns and he goes over to his partner and he sits down on the bench and waits. Meanwhile, Michael goes inside the locker room. He uses the key. He opens up the lock. He opens the locker up. He checks to make sure the drugs are still there. They are. As soon as that's confirmed, he takes the bag, he throws it over his shoulder, and he walks back out to the main terminal to meet up with Tim and his partner. Tim and his partner are sitting on the bench. They see Michael coming out of the locker room, and they're expecting Michael to walk over and basically hand them a bag full of $42,000. But instead, Michael walks up to them and draws a gun and points it at them and says, "I'm a police officer. You're under arrest." It would turn out this was a sting operation. Michael Pfeiffer, the undercover police officer, had been following around Tim and his partner for months. In Michigan at the time, if you were caught trying to sell 650 grams or more of cocaine, there was an automatic penalty of a life sentence. And Tim and his partner had just been arrested trying to sell more than 650 grams of cocaine. And so facing a life sentence, Tim took a deal that gave him a lesser sentence in exchange for information about other drug dealers. And so Tim would ultimately serve 2 years and 4 months in a federal penitentiary before he was released. Tim would say his time in prison was absolutely miserable, but it was necessary. It matured him in a major way, and it honed his sense of humor. Tim was always a very funny guy. He was always the class clown and the guy goofing around. But in prison, he found it a very difficult task to get these hardened prisoners and prison guards to laugh at his jokes. But eventually, with enough practice and repetition, he could get anybody in that prison to laugh at him. And so by the time he got out, he was like an amazing comedian. And so he decided, you know what? Why don't I pursue a career in comedy? 4 years later, Tim Dick, better known as Tim Allen, landed the starring role on the hit TV show Home Improvement. And from there, he starred in dozens more movies and TV shows, but he's probably best known for his voice acting in the very popular movie series Toy Story, where he plays Buzz Lightyear. Today, Tim is sober and has been for decades. The next and final story of today's episode is called Pick Your Poison. On June 14th, 2011, 42-year-old Ellie Lobel stepped unsteadily outside of her house in Wildomar, California, and immediately she had to lean on her round-the-clock caretaker for support. This mother of 3 had just moved to this rural part of California so she could die in peace. For the last 15 years, Ellie had been battling Lyme disease, which is a chronic and debilitating condition spread by ticks. But now, after those 15 years of fighting, Ellie just had no more energy. She could barely stand up on her own, her mind was kind of always in this weird fog, and she just felt totally hopeless. And so Ellie had recently hired an end-of-life coordinator to help her plan for her death and also to make sure nobody attempted to revive or resuscitate Ellie if she fell unconscious. Ellie really thought she was going to die any moment and just wanted it to happen in peace in California in her bed. But dying can be complicated, and Ellie, after moving to California, had laid in her bed for 3 days expecting to die, but didn't. And so, on June 14th, Ellie decided she would just get up, and with the help of her caretaker, she would just go for a walk in her new town. Every step was painful for Ellie as she clutched her caretaker's arm, but the sun was out, the sky was blue, and flowers were in bloom all around her, and just for a moment, Ellie suddenly realized she was feeling something she had not felt in a long time. She was feeling grateful to be alive. But that feeling was very short-lived because as she stood on this sunny sidewalk in California, she suddenly felt something small and sharp smack into her forehead. And Ellie, she kind of looked up and realized it was a bee. Now, she was determined not to let an insect ruin this rare instance of happiness in her life. Ellie just kind of reached up and tried to swat it away. But when she looked up again, she noticed the bee was still there, and worse, there was now an entire cloud, a swarm of bees over her head that were descending down on her. And as this happened, Ellie's caretaker, who saw the swarm, screamed, let go of Ellie, and ran away from her. And so poor old Ellie, who couldn't even stand up on her own, was forced to fall to the ground and kind of cover her head with her hands to try to protect herself. But within seconds, these bees had descended on her and were stinging her head, her ears, her face. I mean, she was getting destroyed. And these were not normal bees. These were African killer bees that were known for stinging their victim dozens of times. And Ellie was fiercely allergic to bee stings. And so instead of dying a peaceful death in her bed, Ellie was now going to die a viciously painful, awful public death out on the sidewalk all by herself. Ellie's life had started out with so much promise. By the time she was just 18 years old, she had already earned her PhD in physics. And then by 1996, when she was 27 years old, Ellie and her husband had 3 beautiful children, and they had moved into their dream home in New York's Westchester County. Her life really seemed perfect. But that same year they moved into their dream home, Ellie suddenly noticed there was this rash at the top of her thigh, and it kind of looked like a red bullseye, and Ellie had chalked it up to, some sort of weird spider bite and not thought much of it, not realizing that that bullseye marking is actually the calling card for ticks who carry Lyme disease. That's what they leave behind after they bite you. But Ellie didn't know that, and so not long after seeing this rash, Ellie began having night sweats and night shakes. She had these flu-like symptoms that didn't go away for months, and it left her totally exhausted and discouraged. Doctors told her that she could have arthritis, or fibromyalgia, or MS, or heart failure, or some other horrible condition, but it was ultimately a park ranger that Ellie just happened to meet one day who recognized that that rash she described at the top of her leg was very likely because she had been bit by a tick that had Lyme disease, and now all of these symptoms, that seemed like Lyme disease too. And then when Ellie went into the doctor and said, I think I have Lyme disease, they said, yep, you do, but now the disease has progressed so far, it's basically too late for you. And so for years, Ellie wasn't able to work or really even be a mother because of this disease. And then eventually her marriage fell apart and ended in bitter divorce. And so this disease really had just kind of wrecked Ellie's life. And so at the 15-year mark of having this disease, she decided, you know what, enough is enough. I'm going to California and I'm going to die on my own terms. But Ellie had envisioned a peaceful death in her bed, not an agonizing death caused by a barrage of African killer bee stings out on a sidewalk in some random town in California. The attack on Ellie lasted maybe about a minute, but it was the longest minute of Ellie's life. The pain was just unimaginable. And then after all the bees had left, Ellie's caretaker actually came running back over to her, scooped her up, and began running with her back to the car. And as Ellie was getting carried, Ellie realized her caretaker was probably going to take her to the hospital, and she didn't want that. Even though she had had that kind of nice moment before the bee stings when she was looking around at this beautiful town and the sun was out and the flowers were out, that wasn't enough to inspire her to want to live. She still, deep down, did just want to die. And so she figured, with these bee stings, I'm going to have an allergic reaction any minute now, and that's going to take me out, and I just want it to happen so I can be done. And so Ellie made her caretaker drive her back to the house and put her in bed, and then Ellie laid there waiting to die. But 3 days later, and Ellie had not died yet. In fact, she actually felt the best she had felt in years. There had been no discernible allergic reaction to all of these bee stings all over her head, and all the chronic pain and discomfort that she normally felt all the time from Lyme disease was gone. And after doing some research about bee stings and about Lyme disease, Ellie came across this 1997 study done in Australia that found the active ingredient in some wasp and bee stings was powerful enough to kill the bacteria that causes Lyme disease. But no one had ever really researched this because it was totally unethical to release a swarm of bees on a critical Lyme disease patient. But in Ellie's case, this happened on its own, and it really did cure her. The bee stings literally saved her life. And since her bee attack, Ellie has become the leading advocate for bee venom as a treatment for Lyme disease. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, MrBallen's Podcast, and we also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen.